What's going on, YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got another one of those theory craft builds for Diablo 4 coming up here. And 1 week from today, if not a little bit less, we've got only a short amount of time. We've got a lot of different builds to pump out there, and this is going to be the #1 favorite from my personal opinion. This is going to be the one that I use on day one. Remember, June 1st, 6 p.m. We're going to be rolling in straight away. If you want to catch that stream live, we'll be doing it for 24 hours, trying to go for 50 in that first day. Hit that link down in the description. Follow me over at Twitch. This is going to be the build that we're going to be running because shadow damage is going to be the most powerful, in my opinion, when it comes to Necromancer. Obviously, things could change as there will be different uniques. There will be different weapons. But when it comes to overall, just looking at all the legendary aspects and the skill points on the tree, this seems to have the most flat damage increase across each one of the builds. With blood, it's all about overpower. With bones, it's all about critical damage and critical strike chance, or critical strike chance is high with the bone build, but the critical strike damage can only cap out at 100% increase. So no matter what, in order to further increase that, we're going to need that flat damage increase. That's where shadow damage is getting up over 300% increase to flat damage. We'll showcase this as we go through and give you a little couple of those tips on what to utilize with leveling. I did utilize this build within the beta and the server slam, so I know how it feels with legendaries and without them. And trust me, it's strong either way, and it's going to be one that's going to carry you all the way into that end game, and guaranteed it's going to have enough crowd control and damage to push through any of that hardest content at the very end. But that being said, let's jump straight into that skill tree. Now, the first skill point we're going to pop into is going to be Decompose. Now, with this basic ability, not only are we going to be channeling together some of that essence by 7 per second, but at the same time, we'll be able to generate corpses every 2.5 seconds, which is going to be pretty powerful for us, especially since we're utilizing Corpse Explosion and we're utilizing the Skeletal Mages. We're going to need that in certain moments, and even more so, and especially with boss fights. Within boss fights, obviously, it's going to be pretty difficult in order to actually generate some of those corpses. We've got some other aspects to this skill tree and some legendary aspects that are going to help us to actually create more corpses, but this is going to be another way that's just going to help to stack into that and just further increase our ability to deal more of that damage and consistently give that damage. But right after that, we've got Enhanced Decompose. If an enemy dies while being decomposed, we gain 10 essence. This isn't exactly the greatest skill point, but it's not the worst one either. The way that this does kind of shine, since this is a single target channeler, later on there are legendary aspects that will give us the ability to hit multiple targets with this, so this actually does end up being quite useful later on. But before we hit to that point, if you've got some of those larger packs of smaller, weaker enemies, this can actually be one of those ways where you can kind of target on each one of those enemies and generate that essence a bit more quickly than you would have before, just to kind of clear faster through some of those dungeons. That being said, real cherry on top for Decompose is going to be Acolyte's Decompose, which you and your minions are going to deal 10% increased damage to enemies who are being decomposed. So that way, any time that we're not dealing any of that core skill damage, or since we're utilizing shadow damage, there's a lot of damage over time. So after we've expended all of our essence, no matter what, once we go back to our basic skill while we're channeling that, we're further increasing the amount of damage that we're dealing, which is going to be even more beneficial, especially against boss fights where we're just constantly ramping up that damage as we're going along and utilizing each skill as we go through the rotation of it. But at the same time, you're going to notice that early on with shadow damage, it just keeps kind of slowly stacking up just base damage, just flat damage increase across the board as we keep going down the entire skill tree. But moving on to the core skills. Now, within the core skills, we're going to be utilizing Blight, which is going to essentially be one of these moments where we throw some black goo over at somebody. It slaps them in the face for 42% damage and then essentially leaves a defiled area that's going to be hitting 112% damage over 6 seconds. Now, further enhancing this, we've got Enhanced Blight, with Blight slows enemies by 25%. Now, one of the big problems with Necro is, a little bit of a lack of mobility. Now, that's not exactly the full truth. We can get a good bit of mobility. We just don't have a lot of mobility skills. But what it does make up for in that case is crowd control. Enhanced Blight is going to be extremely powerful, and with one of the legendary aspects we have, Blight is going to be even more powerful by pulling these enemies in and sticking them to the center for all of that damage over time. But right after that, again, like I told you before, we've got a lot of flat damage increase that just keeps slowly incrementing up as we go through this skill tree. Supernatural Blight. You and your minions deal 15% increased damage to enemies within Blight. Like I said before, we're slowing them. We're going to be able to pull them in with a legendary aspect that we'll be talking about little bit later in the video, it starts to get a bit ridiculous when it comes to blight and just shadow damage in general as we keep going through. Now, before we push further down in the skill tree, we've got 3 things to talk about right here that are not necessarily things that we need to immediately pop points into as we're leveling. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is Hued Flesh, considering this is one of them that I would say is way later down the skill tree. I'd almost argue that sometimes, or most of the time, you're more than likely not going to need this immediately, especially if you're playing with other players. This is going to be something that's going to help out solo players more than anything else. So if you're solo leveling with a necro, this might be something you want to kind of put some points into, considering we're utilizing Corpse Explosion. But if you got other teammates with you and you're playing with friends, save this one until after you've already gone through the entire skill tree. It's just something that's going to further help out to increase the amount of damage we can deal out, especially against single targets like bosses. Now, with Hued Flesh, Lucky Hit, your damage has up to a 12% chance to create a corpse at the target's location. This chance is doubled against bosses. The main reason we're using this is for boss units. Other times it can be beneficial, but essentially, if you don't know what Lucky Hit means, this is the big reason I say, like, this is one of those that you don't want to have to immediately go for, considering it's one that's going to help us, but it's not always something that's going to guaranteed be something that's extremely beneficial. So if you don't know what Lucky Hit means, anytime you've got one of those skills that's dealing damage, you'll notice they have a lucky hit and then a 40% or whatever their percent chance is. Essentially what that means is it has a 40% chance anytime that this hits or you use this skill to have a lucky hit. Now that doesn't mean instantly we're going to create a corpse right on that moment. That means once we finally hit and proc that 40% chance, we're going to have a 12% chance after that. That's going to be the possibility of a corpse being dropped down there. And with a boss unit, 24% chance. So effectively, the math that we're going to be doing is 40% times that 12%, and that's going to give us our proc rate, which effectively is going to be 5% chance anytime we deal damage, we can get a corpse to spawn, or with a boss unit, a 10% chance for a corpse to spawn. Now, 10% from all the damage we're dealing, since we're dealing damage over time, we've got Corpse Explosion that's also dealing damage over time, which we'll talk about here in a moment. We've got Blight dealing damage over time, and we're channeling with Decompose. So there's a lot of seconds. There's a lot of different types of hits going on every second that's happening. So no matter what, that 10% chance may seem really abysmally low, but in a boss fight, trust me, since we're dealing so much damage and hitting so many different times, it is actually going to proc quite often, not to the same level of when we're just kind of like clearing through dungeons and the whole floor is covered in corpses, but it will be about 5 or 6 every minute. That's just going to be extremely helpful with maintaining our skeletal mages and just maintaining an even efficient amount of damage from our Corpse Explosion over time. But that's one that I would say, you know, if you're playing with buddies, this is one you don't have to put points into until way later, because it's going to be compensated by the damage of your other players you're rolling with. But if you're solo, you definitely want those corpses getting spawned in. I'd say you'll want to slowly put 1 point at a time into this, if not, you know, at least 2 points by the time you've filled out Corpse Explosion, considering early on your damage is going to be perfectly fine with just Decompose, your skeletal mages, your skeletal warriors, and the Blight. But the 2 points above that are ones that I'd say, yeah, you probably do want to put points into this, especially if you haven't been able to reach the point of unlocking Corpse Explosion just yet. We'll have Unliving Energy, which is going to increase our essence by 3. We'll only put 1 point into that since it maxes out at 9. Virtually just not enough to really make a difference. But right after that, Imperfectly Balanced, where core skills cost 9% more essence, but we deal 15% more damage. So sadly enough, this only goes for our core skill. Do keep that in mind. This isn't going for flat 15% increased damage to everything, but trust me when I say 9% more essence cost on Blight isn't going to cost you one of your abilities to, or less amount of times to actually use this ability every time that you've got max essence. Normally you'll have 2 to 3 times every single time to be able to utilize your Blight skill. I mean, we've got 100 total essence increasing by 9%. Let me do the math real quick. And effectively, the cost of Blight is only going to go up by 2.25. I mean, 2.25 essence cost increase for 15% more damage. Anybody would be crazy to not actually go for this. Nobody in their right mind would ever say that you don't need 15% more damage, especially at a low cost of 2.25 essence every single time. Now, you may not be able to just immediately throw out 4 of those blights, but you'll still be able to throw out 3 of them. And trust me when I say, once we get further down the skill tree, our essence regeneration is so fast that it won't even matter. We'll be able to constantly be spitting these blights out no matter what. But that would be something that I would say, if you're leveling and you haven't made it over to unlock Corpse Explosion just yet, start filling some points into that. You know, don't fill this up to 5 just yet. We want to fill that in a little bit later as we're pushing further and further down the skill tree. Obviously, we want more damage with it, but we don't want to just stack that straight into Blight just yet, as there's a multitude of other things that we need further down the skill tree that are just going to help us ramp up, and then later on we'll start stacking the damage up on this just to really flesh it out and give it its maximum power. But moving on from that point, we're going over here and we're going to unlock Corpse Explosion. Now, Corpse Explosion's not as powerful as it was in the beta, and some necromancers may not utilize it as much, but when it comes to the blighted version of Corpse Explosion for its shadow damage, obviously we'll go for enhanced Corpse Explosion for its increased radius, but we've got blighted Corpse Explosion, which turns this into a darkness skill. Now we've got full shadow damage from this, up to 110% damage over 6 seconds. Now, at this time, I don't know whether or not stacking up the damage for Corpse Explosion, ranking it up, is actually going to further increase that 110%. That's something I'm going to have to test out once we get into the actual launch of the game, just to see whether or not, I couldn't remember from the beta or the Server Slam whether or not that was something that affected it. It seemed like it did, but if anything, if those points don't actually do that, or if you're worried about that, you could just pop those points out and throw them into Decrepify. No worries, trust me. It's a very simple, easy switch over if that is the case. But I'll be doing another video on this build once we actually get it fleshed out in game. So no matter what, this is Theorycraft. Anything could change, but we've got everything that we need with this. But moving on from that point, we've got 2 things that we'll need to grab up before we start heading forward. Now, when you're leveling, I'd say you only want to put 1 point into this, and then you could possibly put 3 points into this if it's going to be necessary in order to keep pushing on. I'd say in the beginning, just put 1 point into Corpse Explosion. Don't rank that up to 5. You don't want to just keep pushing those points into that. We want to keep pushing down the skill tree as we're leveling, instead of just stopping at 1 and filling that up just yet. But if you need a couple more points before we get to the curses, Grim Harvest. Anytime, since we're utilizing Corpse Explosion, every time we consume one of those corpses, and when we consume them to enhance our skeletal mages or just to create more skeletal mages, we're gaining 9 essence every time. A lot of resource regeneration with this. Like I said before, Blight, we're going to be able to just keep spitting that ability out at all times. We've got a lot of resource generation with this build. But right after that, Fueled by Death, since we're utilizing Corpse Explosion, every time we consume 1 corpse, we're increasing our damage by 9% for 6 seconds after that. And sadly enough, this doesn't stack, or at least I don't think it stacks. But we'll essentially consistently just have this up. I mean, 6 seconds is a long time. Any time that we just keep consuming those corpses, it's just going to keep perpetuating that 9%. No matter what, you just can't go wrong with having another flat 9% damage across the board for all of your skills, including the Corpse Explosion as well. But after we filled those points out, we'll move over to the curses. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is going to be Iron Maiden. Now, Iron Maiden isn't exactly the greatest skill in the world, but it can be utilized in the right ways. Now, effectively, Iron Maiden is one of those that will curse enemies, and they will deal damage and then basically have like a Thorns effect. They're going to be dealing 10% damage back to themselves, and it lasts for 10 seconds. That's how long that they're cursed before you have to curse them again. But Iron Maiden does end up being even more powerful, considering Enhanced Iron Maiden, we no longer have an essence cost for this, and anytime the first time that we put this curse onto any number of the enemy, or any enemy the first time, we're going to gain 5 essence from this. Think about any time that you're in one of those dungeons, you got one of those large packs, boom, you just wasted all of your essence. We can just literally hit 1 pack. I mean, 5 times 6. We've already got 30 essence back. Or 5 times 10. We've got 50 essence back. Goodness. I'm thinking about the math all wrong here. But the amount of times you see 10 plus different enemies that you're able to curse instantly, and you'll just be able to get all of that essence back immediately. Now, if you were doing a minions build, it could get really powerful with Iron Maiden if you're really kind of looking at this skill and thinking to yourself, how could this ever be useful? Trust me, when at least 3 enemies is afflicted by Iron Maiden, its damage is increased to 15%. We can get this up to 14%. That's about 29% damage every time that they actually attack anything. We're not talking about just like attacking you. This is anything. And you imagine that with any time they're attacking your minions, they're dealing 29% damage back to themselves. That can be absolutely ridiculous, ramping up the amount of damage. But that's not the route that we're going to go for. We're going to go for it up here at Iron Maiden. Heals for 5% of your maximum life when an enemy dies from afflicted with Iron Maiden. Trust me, we're going to be utilizing both of these curses pretty much everywhere we go, as it's further going to increase our damage. There is a legendary aspect that once we have people or enemies afflicted by both of these curses, we have a further increased 40% increase to our damage. Gets ridiculous as we just keep ramping it up, but we'll be able to maintain a large amount of resource generation through using Iron Maiden, and anytime that they're just striking things, boom, they're taking damage back. We're also going to be healing ourselves, giving us a bit more of that survivability. But on top of that, we'll move down and amplify damage. This isn't something I would say immediately you have to put points into this as we're leveling, but later on this is going to be something that just further increases our damage by 9%. Anytime that we've got one of these enemies cursed, we're just dealing more damage to them. But just below that, we've got Decrepify. Now, Decrepify is really useful, actually. It's still going to cost us 10 essence, but with Iron Maiden, we're going to be making a lot of that essence back with consuming the corpses. Every time we're getting at least, 9 essence back every time. So pretty much as soon as we get one corpse out of this, we basically made our money back, or made our generation back of essence. But we'll be slowing enemies for 40%, and they'll be dealing 20% less damage to us. You just can't go wrong with this type of ability. Really helps out in the end. It's just damage reduction and crowd control. Extremely beneficial for us, but at the same time, we've got the lucky hit chance. Now, sadly enough, this is a pretty low proc chance on the lucky hit for Enhanced Decrepify, but since we're going to be just afflicting everything, and we need the passive point right after this, that's just going to help us to just kill really fast and clear dungeons as quick as possible. But you can't go wrong with the ability to possibly have a stun from these afflicted. But right after that, when you and your minions hit an enemy afflicted with Decrepify below 10%, they instantly die. This is just going to generate more corpses. You're going to be able to clear packs a lot quicker. You're going to be able to just generate a lot more health a lot quicker as well. So considering we've got that Iron Maiden going at the same time, we're getting 5% maximum life for each enemy dying. If we're able to just instantly wipe them out, we've got all that damage over time going. Skeletal mages hitting. I mean, it's just, everything just keeps stacking. Like, you just think about that, we've got them pulled in, where it gets stronger after that. It just gets even more stronger. Like, as I'm just trying to explain it out, I'm just like, yeah, it just keeps getting stronger. I wish I could just visually show it the whole time. But right after that, we've also got Skeletal Mage Mastery, which the Skeletal Mages are going to be dealing shadow damage, and they can stun targets. We'll showcase this once we start talking about the Book of the Dead. But we'll increase their health and damage by 60%. Not exactly, 60% seems like a large amount, but it's not actually going to be the most devastating out of all things. But since we're increasing damage overall across the board, even for our minions, they do get to be something that is absolutely, that stacks up with all of the damage, and their shadow damage is instant, which is really nice, instead of just having another damage over time. But at the same time, they'll be able to inflict this thing called Blight, or Shadow Blight, later on as well, and that's why we'll want to keep them up as alive as long as possible and constantly dealing damage to certain enemies. It's going to be something that further increases the amount of shadow damage we have going forward. But while leveling, one of the big things to make the trade-off here, I gotta speak about this before we move on going forward and start talking about the increases to shadow damage. I will say we will have to move this over. Like, before we get a legendary that further increases our damage from having Iron Maiden and Decrepify, I would prefer having Iron Maiden, considering it's just a resource generation and it's something that gives us more health over time for free of cost. We can just keep spamming that ability no matter what, and it's just not going to affect the rest of our capabilities for any other skill, whereas Decrepify will eat into our essence cost. But before we have the legendary that causes blight to pull in enemies, and before we have the legendary that also gives us 40% increased damage for both curses, you're going to want to use Corpse Tendrils. Corpse Tendrils is actually amazing. I really love this skill. I didn't exactly like it in the very first time that I was playing the Necro in the first beta, but essentially Corpse Tendrils is going to be the way that we're going to be able to pull in all of these enemies. We'll be able to slow them, we'll be able to stun them, and at the same time we'll be able to make them vulnerable. Now there is also one other catch side of this that could create a little bit more survivability, and that's if you wanted to go for the 30% chance to drop a blood orb when damaging enemies. This is something that's unique to Necromancer, where we get 15% max life anytime we pick up one of these blood orbs. That can be nice for a good bit of survivability, but if you're playing with something like the rogue or just about anybody in general, vulnerable, if you make any enemy vulnerable, no matter what, you're dealing 20% increased damage from all aspects, no matter, not just yourself, not just your minions, but every other teammate as well is going to be dealing 20% increased damage to whatever target is vulnerable. So you just can't go wrong with ramping this up and being able to pull them all in. They'll be stunned for 3 seconds, and they just can't do anything for that moment, and you've got them clustered in. You imagine one corpse in there, boom, we've got that corpse explosion, we're doing damage over time, we've got blight in there slowing them as well, and they're slowed by another 50%. They're going to be having a hard time coming out of that, so no matter what, you've just got them sucked into this location where you'll just be able to completely deal massive amounts of damage, and you'll get them sucked into the point where you can just hit all of them with that one curse, be able to maximize your ability to gain all that life back, and gain all that essence back so you can keep spamming that blight on them. It just gets ridiculous. That damage is just overpowered. But once we get the legendary for blight that pulls them in, we'll no longer need this, and we can utilize the Decrepify with the other legendary to maintain increase to maximum damage overall. But going forward, we've got more to talk about. Right after we've gotten that, if you haven't leveled it up, or after you've gotten Corpse Tendrils, I'd say you want to start moving into this territory, which is going to be everything that further increases our shadow damage. So Reaper's Pursuit, I would say when we're leveling, just put 1 point into this. You only want to fill this out later once we've actually filled out the rest of the tree. This is just something that's going to give us more movement speed every time that we're dealing damage with our darkness skills. 15% for 3 seconds. And since basically every attack we're dealing is darkness, we're constantly going to have an increase of 15% to our movement speed. But Gloom, right after that, when you damage enemies with darkness skills, they take 6% increased shadow damage from you and your minions for 2 seconds. This stacks up to 3 times, so we've effectively got about 18% increase to damage every time that we're dealing damage to any one of these. So anytime, I mean, even while just channeling with Decompose, I mean, after 3 seconds, that's 3 hits right there, boom. I mean, or I think it might be faster than that. But essentially, we'll have Corpse Explosion, we'll have Blight, and then we'll have our minions striking, and then we'll have Decompose strike. I mean, it may only last for 2 seconds, but we'll be able to maintain that 18% stack for a long period of time when we're clearing packs. It's just going to be massive amounts of damage, even while just fighting with a boss unit, no matter what. We're always causing shadow damage, so maintaining 18% damage increase is going to be very easy. Now, darkness skills, or we've got terror after that. I would say fill this one out first. Going to be a whole lot easier to maintain 18% stack of gloom than it would be with terror. Now with terror, darkness skills deal 9% bonus damage to enemies who are slowed and 9% bonus damage to enemies who are stunned or immobilized. We are always going to be slowing with blight, so no matter what, we're going to have that 9%. And these bonuses stack and apply to shadow damage dealt by your minions. With our minions, our skeletal mages, they will also be able to stun, and with Decrepify will also be able to stun by a 10% chance. This will happen, not as often as we'd like to, but it further stacks with the simple fact that we have Crippling Darkness, which is another lucky hit chance that we're going to be able to utilize in order to stun these targets for 3 seconds. just further amplifying our capability of adding another 18% damage flat increase. But no matter what, we're always going to have that 9% from the slowed. That's why we put the points into this. But across the street, we've also got necrotic carapace. This is going to be another thing that is just helping us out with our survivability when a corpse is formed from any one of our skills or minions. We fortify for 6% of our life. Think about the amount of times that you've literally just wiped out 10 enemies. I mean, just some of those small packs. And with this build, it would be very easy. Instantly, within that first second, we've got 60% fortified life right there. No matter what with Fortify, if you don't understand Fortify or what it means, effectively, it's like a barrier of health over our health bar. And the best way to describe it is essentially if we have 50% or 60% fortification and we have 100% health, for that first 40% of health, we won't have that 10% damage reduction. But by the time it reaches the point of 60% health and then our 60% fortified, that's when we'll have the 10% damage reduction. So in order to have that maximum damage reduction from Fortify, we'd have to have 100% Fortify on top of our 100% health in order to have that 10% damage reduction the entire time. Ton of information to spit out here. Hopefully you'll be able to catch up with this. We've got a lot of it to spit out later on. But that is just going to further help out with our survivability in the long run, especially once we get into the harder content. No matter what, just having Fortify and having a 10% damage reduction on top of the 20% damage reduction we're going to be applying with Decrepify, so that's a total of 30% damage reduction from most of the targets we'll be facing off with, just helping out with survivability. But the final skill point that we're going to actually go for, we're not going to go for anything when it comes to the actual ultimate abilities. There is a legendary aspect that can change the Blood Wave and the Bone Storm into a shadow damage skill, but I just did not feel them actually being that great. I didn't honestly think they would be something that would be extremely beneficial. The only one that looked interesting was possibly Bone Storm, and that's against world bosses, but that's a completely different conversation for a different day with this type of build. Right now, this is going to be something that's going to help out with just clearing dungeons, clearing the bosses through the campaign, and just making our way to 50 and then getting into that, or pushing into that harder content just to farm out the legendaries that we need later on. But Shadow Blight is going to be the main skill point that's just really going to cherry top that amount of damage we have at the very end. Shadow damage infects enemies with Shadow Blight for 2 seconds, and you and your minions deal 10% bonus damage to enemies with Shadow Blight. Since we're dealing shadow damage with basically everything to every enemy, everything is going to get infected and be dealt with 10% bonus damage no matter what. We've just got another flat 10% damage on top of that. And then every 10th time an enemy receives shadow damage from you and your minions while they are afflicted with Shadow Blight, they take an additional 20% shadow damage. Since we've got Corpse Explosion and Blight and all of these other different damage types constantly going over time, no matter what, we're going to be infecting them, and it's just going to ramp up pretty quickly to the effective nature of just having a 30% increase to damage at a certain point, especially against boss units. It may not be immediately that 30% damage, but we'll be able, once we hit that 30% damage, it's just going to hold that amount of damage all the way until that guy just gets melted. Shadow Blight's going to be pretty ridiculous with the shadow damage, and there are some legendary aspects that we need to get into now that are going to be absolutely devastating at further increasing this overall damage. Now, let's move into the legendary aspects. All right, now we're over at the legendary aspects that we're going to be looking for when it comes to the overpowered shadow necro damage. But yeah, we've essentially taken a lot of time on that skill tree, so I'll try to just kind of bum rush through this since there's a lot of things in this that we've already talked about. But an aspect of the void is going to be one that you'll definitely want to grab up. This is the Blight's defiled area when spawn pulls in enemies around the affected area. This is effectively going to be the legendary aspect that replaces corpse tendrils for us, so that way we can move over to Decrepify to further increase our damage based on another legendary. Now, torturous aspect, enemies afflicted by Iron Maiden have a 15 to 25% chance to be stunned for 1 second when they deal direct damage. Since we're affecting them with afflicting pretty much every enemy we see with Iron Maiden, and it's going to be free of charge, you really can't go wrong with utilizing this legendary. We'll be able to find this one at Deserted Underpass in Kyrgyzstan. Can't remember if I or I'll just tell it at the end, but at the same time, like, I'll have a link over to this build. Some of these legendary aspects we will be able to unlock in certain locations, and through this website we'll be able to tell what location that is. So once we get to the full version of it, you can just kind of come back, hit that link and then check out which one of these you can find at certain areas as we're leveling through. But I'll make a completely different video later on to kind of detail these legendaries out. This one's just for showcasing what we're going to be looking for and how much damage we can be expecting when it comes to endgame once we get these. But right after that, we've got Blighted Aspect. This is where some of that damage starts to get pretty crazy. You deal 50 to 120% increased damage for 6 seconds after Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. I mean, since we're dealing damage every moment with Shadow Blight, and I mean, even think about it in a boss fight, we're going to be damaging that boss 10 times very quickly, and then having 6 seconds of possibly 120% increased damage overall across the board. I don't think it goes for the minions, but just having ourselves get that 120% is unreal from just using Shadow Blight's damage. That's going to be really powerful, and we'll be actually able to unlock that one from Khan's Grasp in Haywazer. I don't even know where that's at, but trust me, I'm going to be looking for that police as soon as we get into launch day. Now, going forward, we've got the Protecting Aspect when an enemy hit or when hit while not healthy, which effectively, if you don't understand what healthy means, is healthy is anytime you're above 90% of your maximum life. You're unhealthy anytime you're below 90% of your maximum life. A magical bubble is summoned around you for 3 to 5 seconds, basically completely immune while you're inside of this bubble. It can only occur once every 90 seconds. This is something that can save your life in boss fights. I mean, if you played the beta or the server slam and you found this aspect, or this legendary aspect, it is very powerful. It can help you and save you in so many different ways. Even against world bosses, this is something that's huge, because not only can you utilize this bubble, but anybody that's on your team can jump into the bubble and become immune as well and be able to fire from it. Right after that, we've got Vicious Aspect, which is going to increase the number of skeletal mages we have by 2, so that way we're going to have 5 of those mages rolling at all times. Or was it 4? I can't remember how many I was able to hold. I feel like I had 3 skeletal mages before I had an increase of 2, but besides the point, that's just going to be 2 more chances for us to have amplified more of that shadow damage and capability of those shadow mages to actually start stunning those enemies, further increasing that shadow damage by that extra additional 9% from that 1 spec in the skill tree. But Aspect of the Dam is right after that. This is going to be the one that causes us to use both of those different curses. You deal 30 to 40% increased shadow damage to enemies afflicted by both the Cripify and Iron Maiden. I mean, further, another 40, at the lowest, 30% increased all of our shadow damage across the board. You really can't go wrong with that. Anytime we're using Decompose, again, another that 10% from Decompose to 15% from Blight, now 30% increase from that, and the shadow damage from Corpse Explosion, on top of the fact that we're dealing Shadow Blight, which is infecting them and dealing shadow damage. I mean, it just really ramps up over time with these legendary aspects. And I think probably, how do I move myself over? Let's move myself over real quick as we get into the other aspects. And we've got the Aspect of Decay over here. Each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to enemies, it has increased the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by 20 to 40%, stacking up to 5 times. That's 200% increase by the time that stacks up to 5 times when it comes to our Shadow Blight damage. You can start to see how it just gets absolutely ridiculous with flat damage increase from shadow damage overall within the Necro skill tree. It just gets absolutely overkill in certain aspects. I don't know if it's actually going to be that overkill, but I can't wait to test this out as soon as I see this one. Considering this one is only dealing with the Shadow Blight's damage, that does have that 10%, but 200% increase on that is a massive amount of additional damage you can be causing at any given time, especially against boss units. Right after that, we've got the Rotting Aspect. Decompose can chain up to 2 additional targets. When Decompose spawns a corpse, it has a 30 to 60% chance to spawn a corpse under all afflicted targets. That is that is completely powerful in the aspect of not only in certain moments when we're clearing dungeons and we're hitting 3 targets, if we get a corpse to pop out from one of them, we can effectively have 3 corpses, or within a boss unit, if we're just decomposing that one unit, we can have 2 every time that it actually spawns 1 corpse from that 2.5 seconds. That's just going to help us tremendously the entire time that we're utilizing this basic skill at any given moment. But right after that, we've got Cadaverous Aspect. Consuming a corpse increases the damage of your next core skill by 5 to 10%, all the way up to 50%. So we've got another possibility of just having 50% increase to our damage on our core skill of Blight. Again, we're going to be consuming corpses all over the place just to get the mages back in, or just causing more of that corpse explosion damage. No matter what, we're always going to be ramping up the damage. But right after that, we've also got the aspect of the Expectant. Attacking enemies with the basic skill increases the damage of your next core skill by 5 to 10%, up to 30%. And since there's going to be moments where we're just going to be channeling for a moment just to create corpses, or in general, we're always going to be just constantly pushing back to just channel more for that 10% increase to damage, and then having the capability of turning that around to be 30% additional damage to our Blight, and then be able to drop that on the ground, just quickly drain all of that essence by throwing all the Blight onto a boss unit and having that be damage over time, and then being able to go back to channeling and have an additional 10% on top of that, effectively having a 40% increase to damage anytime we're utilizing that. It's absolutely ridiculous. Just so much flat damage increase across the board with Shadow Damage Necro. I can't wait to try this out on launch day. But when it comes to our gems, we're going to go with the Amethyst, which is going to be 8% damage over time, since a lot of our damage is going to be damage over time, more specifically with Blight and Corpse Explosion. No matter what, we do want to just amplify how quickly that does melt every second that it's ticking for that damage. Now, up next, right after that, we're going to go with the Topaz on this one, considering we don't actually have a whole lot of capabilities of becoming unstoppable or anything that's like strong with mobility and just getting out of some of those crowd controls ourselves. 10% damage reduction while control impaired is going to help us out greatly with just more of that survivability as we push through the content. Now, when it comes to the jewelry diamonds, or the jewelry, when it comes to socketing it, this is going to be one of those where I'd say you kind of want to keep one of each one of these gems when it comes to going into a nightmare dungeon or something along the lines. You can't go wrong with just slotting a diamond in, as it's just going to give you a flat resistance to all. But I don't know what happens in some of these dungeons or the Tree of Souls, whether or not we're going to be going into instances that have a specific damage type, and whether or not we can socket a gem as we get into that. Because if it is a mystery as to what the roles of the modifier are going to be for some of these dungeons, and it does end up being specific damage types, you may be better off leaving your jewelry unsocketed, and then when we come in, if you've got all of these gems ready to go and you find out one specific like cold damage or lightning damage, we'll be able to slot that in to get maximum resistance to that and just further increase our survivability. Or even in one of those moments when you're facing off against one of the world bosses like a Shava, you may have the diamond on for the rest of the time that you're running, but then you want to run, or you want to unsocket it and put in an emerald before you go in and roll into a Shava, just to have that poison resistance. But one last thing that we need to talk about, that's going to be the Book of the Dead. Now, with Skeletal Warriors, we're going to sacrifice them just to get another 10% increased shadow damage overall. This used to be 15, I'm pretty sure. I feel like they just nerfed it by 5%. Pretty irritated about that, but 10% overall flat damage for all of our skills that are shadow damage is still amazing with how much else shadow damage we have on top of that. Now, with Skeletal Mages, we want the Upgrade 1 Shadow Mage's attacks have a 10% chance to stun for 2 seconds. This cannot happen on the same enemy more than once every 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds, we have the capability of a 10% chance of them being stunned for 2 seconds. So no matter what, we're dealing shadow damage with them, and on top of that, we're capability of causing them to get stunned as well. This can be something that also procs on boss units for their stagger bar. If you don't know what stagger bar is, it's effectively with a boss unit, just below their health bar is like a yellow-orange bar that gets filled up anytime that they get hit with something that's like a crowd control ability. By the time you fill that out, they get knocked over onto the ground, and you've got about 5 seconds to just basically deal as much damage as possible without them being able to move or attack. And those can be huge opportunities for anybody to just get massive damage in and finish them off quickly. Right after that, we've got the Golem. We're going to be sacrificing that as well, and we're going to be gaining a 30% increased critical strike damage. Now, this is something that, you know, you could choose on your own. I'm going to have to play around with this. I don't know whether or not the 10% increased attack speed is going to be better in this instance, just for more resource generation, or possibly 10% maximum life for more survivability. But in the leveling process, the 30% increased critical strike damage can be pretty beneficial, as there is one thing that I need to talk about, and that is the aspect of grasping veins. Now, before you find the legendary that possibly is going to get you blight, pulling in the enemies whenever you strike with it, or the legendary that's also giving you the 40% increased damage with both afflicted from the curses, aspect of grasping veins is going to be absolutely amazing. This is one that we can find as well within one of the dungeons over at Kyrgyzstan at the Corrupted Grotto. I mean, gaining 10% to 20% increased critical strike chance for 6 seconds when you cast Corpse Tendrils, that's unreal. That could be a flat 20% increase to your critical strike chance of any time that you're attacking. And if you've got gear that's possibly further increasing your critical strike chance, just popping that ability, you've got 20% increase. But not only on top of that, you deal 30 to 60% bonus critical strike damage to enemies damaged by the Corpse Tendrils, which is effectively going to be the only enemies you're more than likely attacking after that point for 6 seconds. But having that 60% and then having that increase of 30% from the Golem, you're 90% increase to your critical strike damage, and you've got that huge increase of possibility of 20% critical strike chance while leveling. This is definitely one that you would want to slot in while you're making your way to 50 before you have those other legendaries. And arguably, I wish I could slot in the it's possible you could possibly take off the skeletal mages and then pop in Corpse Tendrils just to utilize this for more critical strike chance and just trying to amplify that damage. I'm going to have to look into that once we get into the launch day, but for right now, this is what I know actually works. I don't necessarily need Corpse Tendrils, but something like this makes me lean towards the aspect of maybe this would be a better option for more damage and possibly more survivability in the long run when it comes to the harder content. Whether or not the skeletal mages are actually going to deal more damage as compared to grasping veins, as the big thing about skeletal mages, why I choose them, is the fact that they can spread the shadow blight. They are dealing more shadow damage, whereas Corpse Tendrils is not going to be doing that. But Corpse Tendrils is going to be pulling in those targets, stunning them guaranteed, and making them vulnerable. So it's one of those trade-off moments where we've got to get into the final game to understand whether or not it's going to be better in the long run. But that being said, that's going to be the build right there. I'm going to have a link down in the description over to this build if you want to just save this for later for launch day. And again, if you want to check out this build getting played live, getting leveled it all the way up to 50 on day 1, June 1st, 6 p.m. We're going to be running that 24-hour stream. Hit that link down in the description. Follow me over at Twitch. We'll be running that. And hopefully this is something that's helped you out. We've got a lot more of these builds coming out. If you want to see more of this Diablo 4 content, if you enjoyed this, hit that link down or hit that subscribe button down below. Goodness, we've been talking for so long. I'm kind of just fumbling over my words. But hopefully you enjoyed this, and I'll be seeing you there on Sanctuary on June 1st. Have a good one.